All right, Joe, you're a prominent journalist. Let's get to the question that apparently is the one question journalists have to answer. Where's the plane?
The plane?
The plane, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know.
I have suggested that CNN replace James Earl Jones with Hervé Villechaize.
Oh, that plane, that plane. You know, this is...
The plane.
This is, you know, I spent, by the way, could I just say, it's really great to be back in New York. My wife and I spent the winter in Oxford, where I was a visiting fellow at one of the colleges. And my job there was to finish writing a book, but also to give a series of speeches. And the first speech was supposed to be about the special relationship. And I got up there, I'm from Queens, and yes, thank you. Rockaway Beach, any Rockaway, no? And I got up there and I said, you know, I'm very pleased and proud to be here standing at the podium at Mansfield College, Oxford, thinking about my parents. He said, Oxford? What's he doing? How did he get? And I said, and I'm so pleased that the topic that you've chosen for me tonight is something close to my heart, and that is the special relationship between the United States and Israel. You didn't get it either. Nobody laughed. They were frightened.
Who knew there were that many Jews at Oxford? That's
right.
all I could say.
But in any case, I come home and I turn on CNN at 6 o'clock at night, because that's something I kind of do in preparation for the 6:30 network news, to see what Wolf is being really hyperbolic about. And he's talking about the plane. I mean, well, actually, this is a matter of real sadness about which I can speak entirely candidly now, although I did in the past, because Time magazine has been spun off from Time Warner. But I got to say that it is such an embarrassment to our profession that CNN has gone in the toilet the way it has. It really is. You know, I miss being able to turn on a straight newscast, and it turns out the only place you can go to get one at 6 o'clock at night is Fox.
That's right. Yes.
It's true.
Don't mumble, folks. He's telling you truth. Special report by Bret Baier.
The other option is to go to MSNBC and see the Reverend Al Sharpton, who I still consider to be a major criminal. I mean, the guy gets a job. The guy can have a job on network TV, on an NBC cable network, and he still hasn't apologized for Tawana Brawley? Give me a break.
By the way, in the moments that follow, I will try to bring Joe out of his shell.
No, I've been in a shell for a while because I've been writing this book, and now I'm out and I can. Okay.
I will say, as a 9-year veteran of CNN, who has many friends there and who thinks what it could be is quite extraordinary, and I think some of the work that I did at CNN was part of that. The night that convinced me that it was time to, you know, kind of bid adieu. And if you think I'm making this up, go back and check it out, folks. In its continuing award-deserving coverage of Where This Plane Is, they decided to show you how hard it would be to find the plane at the bottom of the ocean. And what they did was to turn off all the lights in the studio and show you, wow, it's dark.
The other thing I love is that breaking news, you see, breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. What's the breaking news? It's still down there.
Oh, no, you missed the better one. The better one, and again, you could think we're making this up because we're just malicious, but this is all true. Until someone finally realized what was on the screen, this was real. Breaking news. Titanic sunk 102 years ago today.
Yes. And you know, I think you know this, that part of the reason why everything is breaking news is because you get to charge the advertisers more if their ads run during a breaking news period.
All right, enough of CNN bashing. They do make about $500 million a year, which may explain why they're not necessarily anxious to move on. But so we got a lot to cover here because Joe is a fellow who covers a lot of different stuff. So I want to start with the political terrain and then we will move on, okay? The conventional wisdom of this political terrain is that this fall of 2014 is going to be a disaster for the Democrats. You agree?
Well, I came here prepared for this question. And, you know, I just want you to know that I can tell you exactly what's going to happen this November. How many of you actually believe that's true? Right? You know, I just can't, you and I have been through this on TV where we both gave snotty answers to questions like this. But journalists are really good at telling you what happened. And pretty damn good at telling you what happens now. But about what's going to happen in the fall, I'm as good as you are. You know, and I've been through enough of these, as you have, to know that 6 months before the election, you know, the terrain can change. Now, there are certain obvious facts. You know, the big meta-historical fact is that in the 6th year of a presidency, especially in the 6th year of a presidency that isn't tremendously popular, you tend to see the out party gain a lot of seats. What's also true is that the Republicans have a natural advantage in the House, and it would be hard for Democrats to take back the House this year, although perhaps not impossible, and that there are an awful lot of vulnerable Democrats who are up for election in the fall. But we can't know how those races are going to turn out. I'll give you an example. Arkansas. In fact, I wrote a column about this a couple weeks ago. The Republicans have put up a very attractive candidate, an Army captain, served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, conservative to a fare-thee-well, which is kind of moderate down there. His name is Tom Cotton, and the Koch brothers have laid down gazillions of dollars. That's probably an exaggeration, maybe a couple of million, to attack the moderate, responsible, kind of boring incumbent, Mark Pryor, whose father, David Pryor, was governor there. And not surprisingly, after the Koch ads, Cotton was leading Pryor by, 5, 6, 7 points. And then Tom Cotton voted for the Paul Ryan budget. And the next week, the Democrats put up an ad that had this woman, you've seen her before. She was Louise, she was also Harry. She was, you've seen this person, this average person. Her name is Ann. And she's from Little Rock, and she shows her bona fides. It's a brilliant ad. She shows her bona fides immediately by showing a black and white photograph of her husband and her 2 kids. We've lived here for 37 years. We've been happy. But now, you see Anne, who has tight curly gray hair and glasses, looking into her Apple computer and saying, but now I've read that Tom Cotton wants to go to voted for the Ryan budget that includes a voucherized system of Medicare where the insurance companies will be able to raise your rates and lower your benefits every year. And then she looks at the camera and says, we don't want that. And you know what happened in the month after that election, after that ad came on? the latest polls have Pryor leading Cotton by 10 points. This was one of the key seats that the Republicans were going to have to take to win the Senate this year.
Which let me interrupt, because that leads to the next question. Because one of the things that, these certainties that disappear
in
6 months was that Obamacare was going to be an enormous burden for the Democrats to carry. And it now appears conceivable that actually they will use the Obamacare, they might not call it Obamacare in a place like Arkansas, but the Affordable Health Care Act as actually a political asset by the fall. And that may be one of the factors you're
But that would be assuming that they were smart, and you can't assume that with these guys. You haven't seen yet, and I suspect that you will. You'll meet, there'll be several iterations of this. You'll soon meet Jerry, brought to you by the Koch brothers. Jerry is a pharmacist in Arkansas, and who's a small businessman, and my health care premium has just skyrocketed by 6% because of Obamacare. Fact is that the average over the last 15, 20 years of premium rate increases is double digit. They've been well down lately, but that'll be the next scare thing. Obamacare is costing all of you money.
Okay.
But Jerry will be followed by Marge.
Okay.
Marge will talk about how she had lost her health insurance, but was able to regain it under Obamacare, and then found out that she had breast cancer, and she's now in remission and been cured. So, we will see between now and November. It's going to be one of the most boring elections you and I have ever seen. Obamacare versus Medicare versus Obamacare versus Medicare.
So in other words, it's like General Hospital for the whole fall.
Yeah.
But let me take this out of this realm. I mean, I have too much respect for you and myself not to go into a state-by-state analysis. I mean, I know, I won't. I mean, it is true that one of the reasons why people think the Democrats are in trouble is a lot of these Senate races happen to be in states where the president is particularly unpopular, or where popular Democratic incumbents are retiring and throwing those races. Okay. But here's the bigger question. Does it matter? In other words, on the domestic front, if you look to the next 2 years, is there any reason to think whether the Democrats have 52 senators or 49 or 54 with a Republican House? Is there any reason to think that anything is going to get done in the next 2 years at all that will make a difference?
Well, 51 is better than 49.
Granted, 49, the Republicans can go
There are Supreme Court vacancies. There's going to be and in fact, there's going to be, I suspect, a treaty with Iran to vote on as well. There are things. It's always better to have a majority.
Okay, so it matters if the Republicans take the Senate, but assuming the Democrats stay where it is, I mean, basically where we are now,
nothing's going to happen except.
How does anything get done?
Well, it depends on what you mean by anything. I mean, anything nowadays is not very much. I mean, what do? They pass resolutions congratulating the Girl Scouts on 75 years of successful Girl Scouting. I think that there may be the fact is, and as you know, and maybe some of you know, I spend a lot of time out in the country doing these road trips, which are crowdsourced. I announce it on Morning Joe or some other program and in the magazine, and I say, here's my route, and if you want to put a bunch of your friends together to talk about politics with me, here's my email address, and I go out and do this stuff, and I haven't done one. I haven't done one this past year because I was working on the book, but as recently as 2 years ago, I can tell you when I did, God help me, 40 town meetings in 20 days, including, and sometimes I reached out beyond Morning Joe watchers and went to the local Tea Party and went to their meetings. But the one thing I can tell you is that the American people are so fed up with people in Washington that it may be getting to the point where people in Washington are listening. I give you as Exhibit A the behavior of John Boehner over the last week, who has been making fun of his own caucus, you know, on the subject of immigration. I think that we've reached a point where even Republicans are beginning to understand that they don't have much future, especially in national, you know, at the presidential level, until they stop denigrating all of these various ethnic and racial groups who are rapidly becoming a majority in this country.
But I'm okay.
I can't go all the way to cynicism and saying it's just nothing's going to happen, because we may see some stuff happen between now and November.
That's actually what I wanted to pursue. So we've heard of, in fact, we've heard a number of Republicans telling their own party, we can't just be against everything. We've got to come up with some genuine, constructive ideas. They've been actually tiptoeing around the issue of ingrained poverty, even inequality. From what you've seen, are any of the things that these Republicans are proposing as an alternative to a kind of orthodox liberalism make sense to you?
Well, they haven't proposed anything yet. A couple of them, you know, a couple of them are in favor of immigration reform, like Jeb Bush, and are in favor of the core curriculum, which are probably going to be the two outlier issues for moderate Republicans in the coming elections. But I'll tell you, I know a guy who is considering running for high office in a Midwestern state as a Republican. And he's a pretty moderate guy. He's a veteran. And that's the book I've been working on, has been about veterans. And he doesn't want to become a Democrat because he's really interested in a lot of domestic policy issues where he disagrees with the public employees unions, especially the teachers union. And in his state, Democrats are pretty strong, strongly organized with a set of beliefs. The Republican Party is an empty shell. And so he goes to a Republican weekend retreat. And it consists of 3 parts, he tells me. The first part is the leaders of the party get up there and say, we have to branch out. We have to appeal to these new constituencies. We have to talk to Latinos. We have to, you know, be more tolerant about gay issues. The second part of the meeting is another group of speakers get up and they just knock the crap out of immigrants and gay people and all the other people that the Republicans have to appeal to. And then the third part of the meeting is new ideas. And there aren't any. Now, this guy is proposing a very interesting set of new ideas, and if he ever actually decides to run for office, I'll tell you about him. But that's the state of the Republican Party right now.
Well, okay. So
but we could do the Democrats in the same way.
Well, I'm getting that. So you're setting me up like. You know,
well, we've known each other for too goddamn long, and it's been more than a quarter century, by the way.
We wrote this whole thing out. If you want to know how it ends, no. Yeah. And that is. Okay, so now if we take a step back and see, the Democrats have been, you know, running things in the White House for 5 or 6 years. It was an interesting thing that Senator Elizabeth Warren said in a column today. It was Gretchen Morgensen's column, Fair Game, which is the New York Times business section every Sunday. And she's been spending the last 10 years of her life basically saying what Elizabeth Warren is saying. Yes. It's just a rigged system and they're getting away with murder. Right. And Elizabeth Warren had a quote. This goes when she was trying to set up this financial consumer protection thing. She said, more generally, on matters financial, she said, the president chose his team, and his team chose Wall Street. And then I'm thinking back to the Clinton administration with the deregulation of massive parts of the financial sector, letting derivatives off the hook, repealing Glass-Steagall, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking, so all these folks who vote Democratic, you know, and say, boy, because this is the party of the people. If you look back on the actual record on this particular issue of rising inequality and what happened to the middle class after the financial collapse, what kind of grades do you give Obama?
Well, during the last campaign, I wrote a column in which I said that Obama's position on Wall Street is indistinguishable from Mitt Romney's. And he called me up and tried to yell at me, but there was nothing he could do. You know, I mean, it's the truth. And also, during the last campaign, I wrote a column saying that if Mitt Romney ever came out and called for breaking up the big five Wall Street banks, he would win the election. Because in this country, people are against big right now. They're against big money, they're against big government, they're against big labor. And I think that this is going to pose a very difficult problem for Democrats going forward, and especially for Hillary Clinton if she goes forward.
Because it seems to me the question would be, I've heard your speeches, but I've seen what the last two presidents, Democratic presidents, Clinton was, you know, putting people first in the name of the forgotten middle class, and Obama went out to Kansas and gave the Teddy Roosevelt Memorial speech about inequality, and then you look at the facts of this particular issue. I can understand people saying, well, yes, but I still have to vote about the Supreme Court, about gay marriage, about abortion, about the environment. But on this fairly core issue, it would seem to me that it would be very hard to argue that the Democratic Party stands for what many people who are Democrats think it stands for.
Democratic Party, when it comes to Wall Street, and especially members of Democratic administrations, I don't want to name names, but say Bob Rubin, you know, Peter Orszag, when he was the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and he was trying to get the Democrats to do a very impossible thing for Democrats, especially for this president, which was to actually try and manage the government. He finally had it after a couple of years, and I went in for our valedictory interview, and I said, so what are you going to do now? He said, you're going to be grossed out. And I said, what? He says, I'm going to work for Citibank. And I said, I'm grossed out. I mean, it's disgraceful. It really is. Who's, you know, in my mind, what's happened over the last 25, 30 years, 30, you know, you get older and you have to change the dates a little, 30, 35 years.
Bobby Thompson hit his home run 63 years ago. Just thought I'd mention that.
I was walking at that point.
Excellent.
I want you to know. But what's happened over the last 30, 35 years is the American economy has been fundamentally distorted by the forces of the financial sector. You know, you could talk about how money influences politics. The way money really influences politics is on the things that you don't ever see. It's on the banking regulations. It's on the regulatory, the whole regulatory machine in Washington. And what's happened is that instead of the big money going to people who invent things, although now it's switching back, it's people who invent websites that I can't understand. Over the last 30 years, and especially during the Clinton era, the economy was twisted to move most of the profits to people who made deals rather than people who made things or invented new things. And you know, you could point to all kinds of tax regulations and the things that you mentioned, the fact that the Clinton administration chose not to regulate derivatives at all. I mean, it's mind-boggling. You can't imagine. I mean, Calvin Coolidge might have thought that that was too extreme a conservative measure. And it's a real embarrassment that Hillary Clinton is going to have to face if she runs, and I'm fully predicting that she's going to face it.
And to go back to what you were saying, that notion you had about with Mitt Romney, there are Republicans, conservative Republicans,
oh, yeah,
who are on the record about, they call it corporate welfare, they call it cronyism. So it almost sounds like, and trust me, this ain't a prediction, that a Republican seeking higher office who made that kind of populist argument at the core of his or her appeal, while at the same time saying, I don't want a big government structure, you know, we got to rein in these public employee unions, but we also got to rein in, you know, the idea that nobody was punished for, let me just make for 2000, what happened in 2007 and 8. I mean, you have far better sources than I do, but I do know one person pretty high up in the Obama administration who was arguing over and over again, some of this behavior is criminal and somebody ought to pay for it, and nothing happened.
Which leads you to raise the musical question, Eric Holder? I mean, what? Give me a break. Where have these guys been? This is, you know, we are at a point where the most important problem that we're facing as a country, you knew you were going to get that line sooner or later, is the diminution of the middle class. And this has been a government that has run 16 of the last 24 years, but all 24 of them for the benefit of the very wealthy, not only on Wall Street, but also in Silicon Valley and so forth, at the expense of the middle class. And I can guarantee you, as someone who's gone around the world, and, you know, I go to revolution after revolution, you know, you have this square and that Tahrir Square and this Maidan Square in Ukraine, and, you know, everybody gets all excited about there being democracy coming and they have an election and then it gets overturned. You can't do democracy without a strong and vibrant middle class. And we are in a situation now where the smartest people I know, even a couple of politicians, believe that unless we figure out how to put the middle class to work and how to have their incomes rising at least the same rate as in, you know, the incomes that come from investment, we're going to be in some trouble.
So what's the explanation, other than the most cynical, for why this doesn't become a genuine policy proposal that is in fact implemented? I mean, the obvious answer is it's because the people with all the bucks control the political process. Is it that simple?
It's, yeah, it's that simple, although with a caveat, and that is that, and there are two caveats, actually. One caveat is that when the public gets interested, and usually in presidential campaigns, people kind of get interested, the influence of money diminishes. I mean, if you know exactly who the two guys are, you know, Mitt Romney could have put an ad on saying that Barack Obama raped his African grandmother or something like that, and no one would have believed it because everybody was watching. The place where the problems come in are in, you know, usually the Senate races have a pretty high profile as well, but when you get down to the congressional level, most civilians, which includes no one in this room because you're here, but most civilians don't know who their congressman or woman is. And when you get down to the state level, which is where there's real garbage going on, you have, you know, you have state legislatures that can be bought ecumenically by the bankers and by the teachers' unions. And it's a real problem. So that leads to caveat number two, which is this. We have been conducting this bizarre experiment for the last 60 years of trying to do democracy without citizenship. You know, things have been going really, really well, and so, you know, most people figure out, you know, my brother says, you know, why should I vote? It only encourages them. And the fact is that, and this is, I'm moving into the territory of my next book, which we could probably get to more frontally later, but if we had a society where each of us had to do something as a citizen, not just, if citizenship didn't mean just residency, but it meant spending a year or two of your life doing something in the government. If government was something that we all did for a little part of our life, and the genius bureaucrats among us went on doing it, then you'd have a much better chance of having elections where people really cared about the small print. But people don't even care about the medium-sized print now.
See, this may seem a bit afield, but I don't think it is. Many years ago, there was a book written by an NYU professor who looked at the media. His name was Neil Postman.
Yes.
And the name of the book was Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought at the time that this was overwrought. This was, just a kind of over-the-wall academic looking for a hook. In the years since, I've become persuaded that I may be wrong, because if you think about it, one of the gifts, and I put that in quotes, of this explosion of media, of not 500 channels, but 5,000 channels, and websites, and tweets, and Instagrams, and Pinterests, and all of that, is that the possibility, that the ability to be diverted from anything of any consequence is now almost limitless. I mean, the reason why, back in the dark ages of, say, the 1960s, that roughly 80 to 90% of the TV audience was watching the network news at 7 o'clock, was there was nothing else to watch.
And you could only have vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry when you went down to the corner for, corner pharmacy.
And so, one of the reasons why you don't have a kind of concentrated focus on bigger stuff is, hell, if I don't want to watch the network news now at 6:30, if I just want to watch sports, I got maybe 10 channels. If I want to watch TMZ's 30-minute excursion into Hollywood celebrities drinking latte in the street, I can watch that. I mean, I do think that the idea of trying to compel people or even persuade people to engage in civic matters it is like geometrically harder than it used to be.
Oh, it is, and that's why you're going to have to build in. That's why you're going to have to build in incentives, and for example, General Stan McChrystal, who is now running this thing called the Franklin Project for the Aspen Institute, which is trying to revive national service, has a really wonderful line. He says, 15 years from now, I want to see the first question that any young professional going into a job interview has to answer if he wants to become a lawyer or she wants to become a marketing executive. The first question that he or she has to answer is, where did you do your public service? I mean, I think that's
Good luck. Seriously.
No, I know, good luck. But let me just say this, and now I will go into the reason why I'm writing the book that I'm writing right now is that I spent a fair amount of time embedding in Iraq and Afghanistan with our kids there, with our troops. And especially after counterinsurgency came in, they had to do things different from what any American troops had to do before. They had to govern these small towns. And it was really hard work. But when I went out, I kept on going to this one same town in Afghanistan, just near Kandahar. It was Taliban Central, and it was called Sanjare. And there was a succession of young American captains, about 30 years old each. They would run a company of 120, 150 men. And their job was essentially to be the mayor of the town. And they did something that no one in human history had ever done for the poor people who lived in these towns, which was they said, we have some money to spend on public works. What do you want us to spend it on? And then the people would respond. And in the town of Sanjare, what the people wanted was for the troops to open up the school that the Canadians had built about 10 years ago, so that and that the Taliban had closed more recently, so that their sons and daughters could go to school. So that was step one. Step two is, we'll take the first captain I spent time with, Jeremiah Ellis from Iowa, from one of the towns along the Mississippi River. Then he had to go and sell it to the local town council, the shura. And what the shura always wanted, not only in that town but in every other town, was irrigation projects so that they could move the water from the Arghandab River closer to their the fields that were owned by the local warlord and police chief so that they could plant more poppies. And as it turned out, give 50% of the profits to the Taliban and 40% to the Karzai family, and 10% they kept for themselves so that they could have more people guarding them, and occasionally go to the Riviera. And I saw this captain work out a deal where he stood them down.
But if I may, because I want to move on.
But no,
there's a point about this that relates to what you want to happen here.
Yeah, and I had this epiphany one day, which was, if Jeremiah Ellis can do this kind of stuff out here under fire, he can go back to Iowa and run for governor. This is a generation that's pointed toward public service. And there's one other thing that I learned just in writing the book a few months ago that came to my mind, which is if you look at American politics as not the spectrum from liberal to conservative, but the spectrum from communitarian to libertarian, this country has been on a libertarian slide for 60 years, and these kids who are coming out of the service now are among the last communitarians we have. A good part of the problem with post-traumatic stress is moving from a tight community where the work you do is important, where you have brothers and sisters, where there's a lot at stake, and moving from there to what some of the veterans are now calling Camp Couch, where you're living at home, you're not asked to do anything in the society, you're scared to death about what's going to happen if you walk out the door and they figure out you're a veteran, they're probably going to be afraid you're going to shoot up the office. To me, that's a lesson, a larger lesson for the rest of society.
And of course, one of the issues is, unlike World War II, where everybody was in the Army or the Navy, the number of people doing this compared to the number of younger people in the country is
1%.
Small.
You know what the veterans are beginning to call the rest of us?
The 99%?
Yeah.
I mean, who don't do anything.
Right.
Let me shift gears for a minute, because
had to get that in because it's something I feel really passionate about, and I really think that if we're going to get back to where we've always been as a country, we have to get back to building communities.
But I don't remember. It's interesting you said this, because one of the people who actually believed in community service, and as far as I know never said a word about it in the campaign, was Mitt Romney. Mm-hmm. A guy I know, former Governor Brian Schweitzer, who traveled with Mitt Romney and came to like him on one of these foreign trips, said that he and I agree about community service. But here's another example. Do you remember, I mean, my memory is fading rapidly, but did Mitt Romney say one word about community service?
It was worse than that. He didn't say one word about veterans. Not one word.
There is that.
I mean, and the Obama administration's treatment of veterans via the Veterans Administration has been a scandal. It's a scandal. This guy Shinseki, they've had in there forever. Have you seen him? The last time I saw him was on a milk carton. I mean, he's not advocating for these kids.
This is one of Jon Stewart's more passionate return.
Well, John and I have done service projects together for a group called The Mission Continues, which is a program that gives 6-month public service fellowships to wounded veterans. And I would recommend to each and every one of you that you kick in and help them out.
So let me cast your eyes abroad to a couple of issues, because as I say, you're one of those folks who both covers domestic politics and spends a lot of time looking at the wider world. Let's talk about, this is the 92nd Street YMHA. Let's talk about the Middle East.
Oh, Dad.
John Kerry seems to have invested an enormous amount of effort in what I believe is now the 758th attempt at a comprehensive Middle East peace solution. I once, when I was at CNN, tried to add up the number of peace plans in the Middle East, and I ran out of numbers. Is there any reason to think that this effort is going to be any more successful than the 757 in the past?
No, it died last week. The fact is that there have been 757 efforts, but only one solution. The solution was put out there by Bill Clinton in December of 2000, and it was put out there again by Ehud Olmert in 2006, and it hasn't been put out there by Obama or Kerry for a very interesting reason. Now, first, we'll go over the solution. The solution, 4 points. Number one, it's a return to the 1967 borders with mutually agreed upon land swaps. You have to hear the second part as well as the first part, because the neoconservatives only hear the first part and they go berserk. But there are maps. I've seen them down to the block of what would be acceptable to both sides. And by the way, privately, both sides think they're pretty acceptable. Number two is Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and the capital of Palestine. Number three, the holy sites in the Old City are governed by an international religious body. Number four, Palestinians have the right to return to Palestinian territory, but not to Israel. Everybody agrees that's the solution.
Well, so what's the problem, Joe?
The problem is extremists on both sides. And the Palestinian side we know about is pretty obvious. They've never said yes to anything. You know, I've had meetings with leaders of Hamas where they say, we really want to play ball. And I say, so what's your first pitch? You going to recognize Israel? Oh, no, well, that has to come after blah, 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 blah. And, you know, are you going to de-arm? On the other side, you have a lot of crazy Jewish meshuggahs. You know, and at this point, the settler movement, I think, has gone past the point of no return. And I'm very pessimistic about a deal being able to be made. But, I mean, all you have to go to is the city of Hebron on the West Bank. Population about 300,000 now. It is the industrial center of Palestine. Believe it or not, there is an industrial center of Palestine. They make things, they sell things, they try and get them out past the punitive measures that the Israelis put on the border. But it's 300,000 people, 299, 700,000 of whom are Arab. And then there are 300 crazy Jews from Philly and Boston who live down in the middle and have an excavation where they bring out coins from 3,000 years ago that shows that Jews always lived there. And the fact is that for there to be a settlement, Bibi Netanyahu or Zippy Livni or whoever is the next prime minister are going to have to say to those 300 Jews, you're getting out, you're coming out. And not only them, but maybe 20%, the maps will allow 80% of the settlers to be in a redrawn Israel. To the other 20%, you're going to have to either leave or become Palestinian citizens or whatever. Do
you regard these two forces, this is a phrase you will be familiar with, are these morally equivalent problems?
Yeah, I think.
Really?
I think that they're, I mean,
on the one hand, you've got.
I'm a supporter of the state of Israel.
Well, what I mean is,
I want to see it survive.
What I mean is this. One of the interesting things is you've had at least 3 prime ministers who were regarded as hardcore Likudniks, each of whom came to the conclusion that some kind of deal had to be made. I mean, Sharon, yes, Olmert, who I saw being denounced by a settler as a traitor to Israel when he flipped, and to some extent, I don't know where you count Netanyahu.
I don't count him at all.
He's not one of those.
No, not at all.
Okay, but is that equivalent to a Palestinian movement that basically says we're just not going to recognize you?
Well, the other part of the Palestinian movement, the part that isn't Meshuggah, you know, exists on the West Bank, and I've been going there every year for the last 30 some odd years, and only over the last 5 or 6 years have I seen what might actually pass for government on the West Bank.
On the West Bank, yeah.
You know, in part because they've asked us to help with security, and now you can walk down the streets of Ramallah and other cities, Hebron, Nablus. You can walk down the streets of them at night without being afraid that you're going to get, taken by a mob. There also had a prime minister who was an economist from Texas A&M and the World Bank, Salam Fayyad, who really got the economy going. It was growing about 8% a year. It was interesting. People I knew in the journalistic community who were not Americans, who were living in Jerusalem at that time, were beginning to migrate to Ramallah because Jerusalem had been taken over by the ultra-Orthodox and it wasn't much fun anymore. Ramallah, you could go to nightclubs, you could go, you could go out for drinking.
Go out on Friday night.
Yeah. Maybe not on Friday night there, but...
well, after prayer. But there's just one more question I have about this area, because this has been a notion, because I have no particular great knowledge of this, having visited the region all of about 7 days in my life. And that is this: I keep referring to these endless amounts of peace plans, and we must take a leading role. And John Kerry is, getting more gray hair by the minute.
And that's a lot of gray hair because that guy has
he has
hair
Joe,
to spend.
Don't get jealous.
I am jealous.
My point is, there are times when I think that former Secretary of State James Baker basically said the smartest thing that an American official could say to these people. He said, look, when you guys are serious, here's the White House number.
Right.
202-254-100. Call us. Mm-hmm. But until then, we got other things to do.
Yes. By the way, I think that across the board, George H.W. Bush conducted the most thoughtful foreign policy of my time as a journalist. And the toughness toward Israel, the tough fairness toward Israel was a part of that. But can I just say one other thing about Bibi Netanyahu? I think that as an American Jew and as someone who wants to see Israel survive and who believes that the only way that Israel will survive demographically is if there's a deal, I think the guy is a total disgrace and embarrassment. And I think that his efforts during the presidential campaign of 2012 to support Mitt Romney were disgraceful. Foreign leaders do not do this. As much as people might conflate United States interests with Israel's interests, they're not the same. Israelis may believe, rightly or wrongly I think, that Iran is an imminent threat to their civilization. Iran is not an imminent threat to the United States, or even a vague threat to the United States. And I was actually called an anti-Semite by Abe Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League because I said that John McCain in 2008 was surrounded by Jewish neoconservatives who conflated Israel's interests in Iran with America's interests. And I was accused of being an anti-Semite because I was accusing them of dual loyalties. It also happened to be the truth. And the fact is that you can't talk about the Middle East right now without talking about what's happening in the Iran negotiations, because they are moving forward, much to everybody's surprise. Every last thing that we asked the Iranians to do in the interim agreement in November, they have done. We haven't done ours because, we promised to lift sanctions, and it's been hard getting it through the banking community. But there's every chance that there will be a deal come July on the Iranian nuclear program. And what's happened, the reason why the Middle East has gone onto the back burner is because the president believes he has one good fight in him against the Israel lobby, against AIPAC, and against the evangelicals who will, who will support everything that Bibi Netanyahu wants because they think there's
so
going to be biblical prophecy.
This could be, we talked about what's ahead for the next year or two. This could wind up being the single most significant fight that Obama will fight for in the rest of his term.
I think so. And I think that you really have to think about what this is about. Iran isn't like other countries in the Middle East. First of all, it's not an Arab country. Second of all, it's a real place. It has real borders. Anytime you see a straight line border in the Middle East, you know that they didn't draw it. Some Europeans did 97 years ago, 98 years ago, Sykes and Picot. Those aren't real countries. Iran is a real place. And it has a real culture, 5,000, 6,000 years old. It's the greatest mismatch between a people and a government I've ever seen. But lately, because these sanctions have worked, they have a new government. These are people that I actually know, especially the foreign minister. And I think that they're reasonable people. I think that they have a very short leash, that there are a lot of unreasonable people there in the Revolutionary Guard Corps who would love to see this thing fail. There are a lot of people who would love to see this thing fail.
Joe, we got good questions from the audience, but there's one area I don't want to forget, and that is Edward Snowden's revelations about the NSA activities. The question that I can put in its bluntest form is Snowden a hero? Is he a traitor? Should he be prosecuted? Should he be honored? Where do you come out on this?
He is, he's not a hero. He's close to being a traitor. He should be prosecuted and given a suspended sentence. I think that Snowden is a very different situation than the WikiLeaks. I guess it's now Chelsea Manning.
Yes.
But because he was pretty careful about what he released. And it pointed out something. I had been following this, for years, from the days that the NSA started it. And my impression was that it was a fairly limited thing. What Snowden made public was that it was unlimited, that they were gathering everything. And I think that it's in our interest, given the bad guys out there in the world, to be able to track the phone calls that suspected terrorists make here, and then the phone calls that the people they call make, and the people that they call make. That's like 2 steps out. And Obama has since, ruled that that's all we're going to do, and that was smart. The place where Snowden distinguishes himself from Manning is that he was careful about what he released. Because of Chelsea, Bradley, Manning, and Julian Assange, 150 human rights activists around the world who were dealing with American State Department officials, including my son, were exposed. A lot of them are in jail now. Some of them have been killed. Others have been forced into exile. That is disgraceful. And I think that the people who think that the United States government is this criminal enterprise run by a cabal of right-wing or left-wing, whatever, dictators manqué, have been seeing too many movies. For the last 40 years, what's the message from Hollywood? The United States government is a criminal enterprise that's run by the CIA or some crazy general. And I just think that it was important for Snowden to do what he did. It's important for him to be prosecuted for it, but it's important for us to recognize that he also did a service.
Just the analogy that I keep thinking about is we learned through a new book the identity of the people who 40 years ago burglarized the FBI offices in Pennsylvania, finding the proof that, in fact, the FBI had itself broken the law by engaging in massive domestic spying against political opponents. The argument being the only way we would ever have found out about the FBI's illegal activities was the illegal acts of the people who broke into that office. So if there's an analogy there, if the only way to discover the many depredations that our government was doing was to break the law, isn't there a functional equivalent there?
Yeah, but you know, from time to time it becomes necessary to do that. I mean, those of us who were part of the anti-war movement in the 60s remember that full well. You know, the question is whether you broke the law by being civil, by being, you know, by staging a sit-down or by throwing a Molotov cocktail through the windows of a mathematics building and killing someone. You know, there's a very bright line there, and I think civil disobedience is the line. So far, that's where Snowden is.
Yeah.
But I can't understand what the hell the guy is doing in that paradise of freedom, Russia.
So let me turn to the audience questions. Now, you did hear, I think, Joe and myself explain why looking 6 months ahead is a fool's errand. So we've got a number of questions about 2.5 years ahead. And we're going to take them as an entry.
I'm much better on that.
Yeah, okay, well, so these people want to know, is there any real likelihood of a Hillary Clinton-Elizabeth Warren ticket in 2016? What are the presidential chances for Cuomo and Christie and the rest of the country? We don't know, right?
Right. You know, I suspect that here's what I think is going to happen.
You're really going to do this, huh?
No, I'm going to do it in the vaguest possible terms. We all know that Hillary is probably going to do this. I suspect that someone like Brian Schweitzer, who you mentioned earlier, is going to primary her with not very much money, and everybody like us is going to, except for us, is going to write him off and say he'll never win this nomination, and then he's going to scare the living bejesus out of her by running against Wall Street, by running as someone with a sense of humor and a sense of candor, and with, you know, some wonky credentials as well. I don't know if anything else is going to. I don't know if he's going to be able to take her down.
Should I tell them my choices for Hillary's running mates? I think they're brilliant.
Yours?
Yes. I think there are two obvious choices for Hillary Clinton's running mate for vice president: Al Gore and Joe Biden. Because I did go to law school, and there's nothing in the 22nd Amendment that says vice presidents have to be limited to 2 terms. So remember, you heard it here first. All right.
And on the Republican side, I think that
Dick Cheney.
Yeah, that party still has a major decision about what it wants to be. You know, I think that Jeb Bush, who I know, who I've interviewed, who I covered when he was governor of Florida, I think he's a very estimable human being and politician. He even can speak in actual sentences, unlike his older brother. But the question is, does the Republican Party want to have someone sane as their nominee? And, you know, the jury is out.
Okay. Here's a question. I think you're going to like this question because, well, we'll see. How is it at the same time gay rights are expanding and women's reproductive rights are narrowing? Don't the same people who favor one tend to favor the other?
Well, this is going to get me into trouble. The problem on the women's reproductive rights front...
Which means abortion.
Which means abortion, not contraception, is technology. And one thing that we could do now, I've seen it with my grandchildren, you can see these 3D sonograms of babies in the womb, and you know that after a short period of time, you're dealing with an actual human being there. And that's made the pro-life argument far more compelling than it ever was in the past. I think ultimately it comes down to a compromise where something like the morning after pill is legal, and maybe the first couple of months, but I have real moral problems with, now that I've seen those sonograms.
You just came back from England. Do you know what the period beyond which you cannot have an abortion is in England?
No.
I think it's
never came up.
I think it's no more than 20 weeks, and it may be shorter, and that's part of the reason.
Yeah.
By the way, what I think Joe underscores is a lot of conservatives even, look at gay marriage and they say, so what exactly is the harm to anybody?
Right.
And then you wind up scratching your head. If you believe that at some point a fetus is more than it's a potential life, it's a very different issue.
I was once debating Gary Bauer on this, and he said, the problem with gay marriage is that it would weaken marriages. And I said, Gary, you're married. It's going to weaken yours?
Yeah, no.
No.
That argument is, there's never been a faster change in any social issue that
it's been the most remarkable thing I've seen in my lifetime in terms of a change on a major social issue.
Is the silver lining of the Citizens United and McCutcheon decisions that public financing of elections will now have more than a snowball's chance in hell?
It does not have a snowball's chance in hell. Does not. Floyd Abrams, during my book leave Hijira, I spent last fall at Harvard, and Floyd Abrams came to speak, and he's, the preeminent civil liberties lawyer.
He's a First Amendment lawyer of the highest rank.
And he actually made the distinction between, that's where I got the difference between Snowden and Manning, was listening to Floyd. And then I asked him about Citizens United. And he said, I believe it was correctly decided. And the fact is that whenever either side tries to get a major social and political issue decided in the courts, you're running off the wrong track. I think the big problem is that, well, first of all, 2 points. First of all, James Carville once said, he might have even said it on this stage, that anything that causes politicians to make fewer phone calls begging for money is a good thing. And so Citizens United allows, Karl Rove to spend $100 million and not elect anybody. But this latest decision is going to make it easier for Sheldon Adelson to just put $50 million on a local congressional candidate, and everybody's going to know, and it'll be a referendum.
Well, he can't give it to one candidate.
An individual can give it to
not
as much
directly to a candidate.
An individual can give as much as he or she wants.
He can give a total as much as he wants to all the candidates, but there are still individual limits.
Okay.
Well, it's a big difference. He
it
can't
is a
give
big
$50
difference.
million to one candidate.
But still, I think that it will limit the donor pool significantly.
No, yeah.
But the answer to this, if you're going to trust Floyd Abrams on this and figure that there aren't going to be laws to bail you out, and that even that restriction may go by the wayside sooner or later, there's only one answer to this, and it is citizenship. It's what I was talking about before. Until people actually care and think that there's something at stake for them, and understand that they are part of something larger than themselves, then, that's the only antidote to this. That's why money doesn't work so well in presidential politics. It's because people pay more attention.
Yeah. It's to be noted that two senators, 20 years apart, who tried to deal with this issue of the Supreme Court money is speech decision, Bill Bradley and now Al Franken, are very candid. They want a constitutional amendment to amend the First Amendment to say, notwithstanding anything in this amendment, Congress shall have the power to regulate the spending of money. Now, I have a different view of this than Joe, which is that I do not think the money is speech thing is a perfect analogy. Because if it were, then bribery would just be a really eloquent speech. But
no, bribery is a subtle speech, and the quid pro quo here is the bright line. All I'm saying to you is that Floyd Abrams.
No, I get it, and I'm saying that it's a very complicated notion to figure out where you stop money without really raising problems. Ralph Nader, by the way, wrote a novel, believe it or not, a few years ago, where his suggestion was that the super rich people, the really, really rich people in this country, should all get together, because they all believe in good things, and spend their money to dwarf everybody else's money and spend the money to do the good things. So that's what I can tell you about that. So
I'm sure it was a laugh a minute, that book.
That's how I've always thought of him. This is a good question. This is a little off the point, but I like this. I like this question here. Since Bill Sapphire is gone, please explain why. I can't read this. Why my ticket, I guess, says taking pictures is strictly prohibited instead of just saying prohibited. Because it's strictly prohibited, which means that the ushers can hit you if you take pictures. So I would be very, very careful about that.
Could I just, I mean, I miss Sapphire. And having spent some time in England where they're both more serious and less serious about the language than we are, my one plea to all of you would be, please don't use the word proactive. You're either active or passive or reactive. Proactive is redundant, and I mean, people are using it all over the place, and the president has used it. It's disgraceful.
By the way, I am for amending the First Amendment to prohibit on criminal penalty the use of any number of words and phrases in political discourse. Right. Iconic, defining moment, at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. It is what it is.
It is what it is.
It is what it is.
How about inflection, when we reached an inflection point?
Inflection points? Yeah, I think.
Turning point. It's a turning point, right?
You get an inflection when dirt gets under your skin, and you take antibiotics for it. And by the way, how come we're so high on antibiotics and antihistamine, you never hear the probiotic or prohistamine side of the argument?
Right.
I think that's disgraceful. Now, this person may have written this question to you because they know of your columns about public employee unions. And the question is, Mr. Klein, why don't you take a sabbatical and try teaching at an intermediate school in New York City?
Well, I've spent a lot of time in intermediate schools, both public, charter, and parochial in New York City and in Chicago and in Boston. And I would say that a lot of teachers, you know, probably even the vast majority of teachers, do the Lord's work. But I have this real problem. I want to see teachers treated as professionals and paid as professionals. But the teachers' union wants to see them paid as assembly line workers and treated as assembly line workers, where seniority is more important than the quality of the work that's being done, where people who should be professionals can be fired. Teachers should be able to be fired. I believe that I am in favor of every request for a raise increase that the teachers' union has ever made. I am opposed to every attempt. You know, unions should be about building floors. You can't be paid less than this. But when the union becomes about building ceilings and saying that the really good teachers can't be paid more, or about building walls and saying we have to have we can only have so many hours that we work per day or per year, or so many hours, and believe me, as a parent, this once happened to me, we only have so many hours for parents' night. Sorry, union says 9 o'clock is the end of it, I'm gone. English teacher once said that to my wife. I think that there's an awful lot of creativity that can be unleashed. I've seen great things happening. I can't imagine how a liberal mayor of any city would want to restrict the growth of charter schools. I think that every school should be a charter school.
There is a political element to this, and I wanted to ask you about it during the non-question part, but this question lets me do it. You've seen Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, Democrat, go to the war almost with the teachers' union, took a strike. You've seen Andrew Cuomo make less dramatic, but some moves. He certainly undercut Bill de Blasio on the charter school issue. You've seen Jerry Brown in California, who in his first life as governor opened the door to collective bargaining, saying, we just can't afford this anymore. Is there something going on within the Democratic Party that many of its office holders are saying to some of its biggest supporters, public employee unions, we just can't do it this way anymore?
Well, you know, if that's what the message is, I would dispute it. Because if we can't afford to pay our teachers really fine salaries for doing really fine work, we're not going to have much of a future.
He's talking,
but the pension.
Joe, I misstated this. It's the pension and health benefit costs that is.
But you know, the thing is that, you know, it's really hard to negotiate with people who are your most active political supporters. And that's the reason why Franklin Roosevelt was against public employees unions, and that's the reason why Alex Rose was against.
And George Meany.
And George Meany. And the fact is that, you know, we got them now, and there certainly need to be reforms in terms of the pension and the health benefits. I think that pretty soon all of us should be involved in Obamacare. All of us. If you're going to have a universal system, it should be actually universal. And those of us who work for Time Inc. now, rather than Time Warner, who have these gold-plated plans, should be paying taxes on the amount of
the benefits
that we're getting. That goes for public employees. It goes for private employees. But you know, I think that the danger, and this is where I get, where people misunderstand me. You know, I'd like to see you take a sabbatical and teach intermediate. I mean, and that's a really good one, intermediate school, because the hormones are running. But my position is I want to see teachers paid more, and I want to see them have more freedom. I do not want to see them negotiate like auto workers, because you saw what auto workers did to Detroit.
I've decided I'm going to ask every guest this at the end of our program, especially those who, like you, have been in the arena, to quote the name of your column,
yes,
for a very long time. As you look to the foreseeable future, which is, of course, an oxymoron, since it's not foreseeable, you find yourself more optimistic?
That should be part of your amendment.
Yes, for sure. Are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the state of where the country's going?
Well, when I'm writing my column and traveling down to Washington, it's still a boring town, by the way. It's nowhere near as good as this place. You know, you can't help but be pessimistic short term. But when I've spent as many hours as I have interviewing our veterans and learning that they're not the liabilities that many of my colleagues portray them as, but they're real assets, and they have a real set of values that came from being part of something larger than themselves. I find it hard to be pessimistic about this country under any circumstances. You go any place around the world, and where's the longest line in town? It's at the American Embassy, people trying to get visas to get in here. There's a reason for that. And I really think that if we try to rediscover some of the things that these veterans have taught me over the last 2 years, it's been the greatest privilege of my career to spend time with them downrange overseas, under fire, but also back here. And we have to learn how to become a community again. There is no such thing as a virtual community, I don't think. And so ultimately, I'm optimistic.
I told you you'd be thinking. Joe, thank you.